All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this to be wonderful learning session on equity analysis in travel demand modeling. My name is Xinbo Mi, and I'm a travel demand modeler at Cambridge Systematics. I'm honored to be your moderator today for this session. And I would like to thank you all for joining us on this journey into the realm of equity analysis in transportation planning. A quick reminder that you should be able to see some poll questions on your screen. Again, if you haven't answered them, please take some time to do so while I'm doing the introduction, and I will come back with the results in a minute. All right, let me now introduce our distinguished speakers to you. Mrs. Ziying Ouyang, also goes by Ying, is the manager of regional models for application and analysis at SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments. She leads a modeling team to apply activity-based models to support agency priority projects such as the regional plan and sustainable communities strategies and corridor studies. Dr. Alex Karner is an associate professor in community and regional planning at the University of Texas, Austin. His work critically engaged with transportation planning practices and achieved progress toward equity and justice. Dr. Willem Klempenhauer is an independent research and data consultant. He works to help agencies and advocates better understand their transit systems through data analytics and thoughtful communication. All right, before we dive into the insightful presentations, let me set the stage for our discussion today. Transportation is a fundamental aspect of our daily lives, connecting us to opportunities, resources, and essential services. However, it's crucial to recognize that transportation planning can have significant impacts on communities and sometimes leading to disparities in access, benefits, and burdens. Our speakers today will guide us through this intricate landscape. Ying will provide us with a practical real-world perspective on equity analysis in the context of SANDAG. And following her presentation, Alex and Willem will provide us with an academic perspective on equity analysis. And during the presentation, please post your questions in the Q&A chat box. And after both presentations, I will open the floor to a panel discussion or Q&A session when I will revisit these questions. And please also include the name of the speaker whom you want to ask your question to. All right, now I'm gonna take a minute to review the poll questions. I'll end the poll now, and I will share results. So can people see my result? All right, thank you. I see a thumb up. And the first question, have you been part of an equity analysis before? More than half said yes. And the second question, if you, did you use a travel demand model? Yeah, and slightly more than half, yes. And question number 3, how satisfied were you with our results? I'm sad that no one picked the Nobel Prize one. And but let's see the other choices. It's pretty spread out, and I think more like overall satisfied with room to improve. And you can see all those distributions among all different choices. For question number 4, was the purpose of such analysis more aligned with which of the following? They're more toward than explicitly to identify equity issues in the region to support finding solutions, then mainly used to be included to comply with relevant laws and regulations. So it's good. And question number 5, last but not least, how do you feel like the equity analysis has affected the decision making at your agency? So more people towards yes than no. So yeah, it's good. I'm glad to see these results. All right, so now I'm gonna stop sharing the results. And so without further ado, I invite Ziying Ouyang, or Ying, to the virtual podium for her presentation. And thank you for being with us today, Ying. And I look forward to an engaging and enlightening session. Over to you, Ying.
Yeah, thank you, Xinbo, for this warm introduction. And it's a wonderful opportunity to present our work at SANDAG. Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen now. Can you guys all see?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about the social equity analysis in the regional plan at the San Diego Association of Governments, SANDAG. Okay, SANDAG is the regional transition planning agency, one of the big 4 MPOs in California. We plan our transition system and build transition projects of all sizes. The first left picture that shows the Otay Mesa, the new planned Otay Mesa East border crossing. And the second picture to the left shows the Blue Line trolley extension of 11 miles to UC San Diego, completed in November 2021. So it's a one-seat ride from San Ysidro across the border all the way to UCSD. We preserve natural resources and make sure our work supports a safe, healthy environment and provide resources directly to communities, such as the free use opportunity pass. The San Diego region has more than 3 million people, a multi-billion-dollar economy, and dozens of diverse communities with different needs. As a public agency, SANDAG has commitments and responsibilities related to social equity. To make the San Diego region a better place for every person who lives, works, and travels here, SANDAG has prioritized equity in the 2021 regional plan more than ever before. We want to ensure that our plans, policies, and actions do not result in disproportionate effect for low-income population or a disparate impact for minority populations. The goal of social equity analysis is to determine whether the benefits and burdens of the projects will be equitably distributed between minority and non-minority, low-income and non-low-income, seniors and non-seniors. Next, I will compare social equity analysis in the past 3 regional plans. For the 2050 RTP in 2011, we used the 4-step model and conducted aggregate analysis at task level. We started to use ABM at the end of 2013. For both 2015 and 2021 RP, we used ABM, which simulates travel at individual and household level. This offers more flexibility to slice and dice the data. We are currently developing the 2025 regional plan, and social equity continues to be the front and center theme for us. The social equity focused populations are minority, low income, and seniors. For low income, the rationale to use less than 200% of federal poverty level is to reflect the high cost of living in the San Diego region as compared to other areas of the state and nation that might choose 100% of federal poverty level. Also, these demographics needs to be able to forecast. We need to be able to forecast them in the future. The 2021 regional plan social equity analysis focuses on 3 areas. For each area, we use a few performance measures to analyze the impact. We used ABM schemes for access to opportunities via transit to employment centers and higher education, and also access to basic needs. We then use GIS proximity analysis for people within a quarter mile of a bicycle facility and half mile of a transit station of commuter and light rail next-gen rapid bus. Next, I'm going to go through two measures in more detail. The first one is the average particulate matter PM 2.5 exposure per capita. I will go through the process to generate a matrix. One of the inputs is the loaded roadway network from the ABM, including volumes by vehicle type and by congested speed. And the other input is the CTMFAC 2017 PM 2.5 emission rates, grams per VMT by truck and non-truck class and by speed band. We first apply a 100 feet by 100 feet grid for the whole entire region, then calculate the emissions based on link VMT multiplying the emission rates. Taking the total link emissions for PM 2.5, then calculate the total exposure at the varying distance within a buffer of 1,000 feet of the link. So that 1,000 feet is a default input. We can also change that to different number. Once we have done that, then we add up the overlapping exposure from nearby links based upon the dispersion for each segment. Then we get a fine-grained level of exposure for a typical day for each of these cells, the 100 feet by 100 feet. We then overlay the cell with population characteristics to summarize the results. Then we will get this table. It's the average exposure for no bill and bill scenarios by different years. So we conduct the social acting analysis in 3 steps. So the first step is to get the matrix for no bill and bill scenarios. The second step is to calculate a percentage difference between billed and no billed. In this case, for minority, we use the difference between 5.5 and the 5.8 and divided by the 5.5 to get a percentage of difference as shown in this table here, negative 6.4 for minority. And for non-minority, the percentage difference is negative 3.5. The third step is to use the difference for social equity focused population minus the focused population. For minority, we'll use the negative 6.4% to minus the negative 3.5%. The results shown in this table, it's the negative 2.9, that's the percentage point. We also calculate the percentage point difference for low income versus non-low income, senior versus non-senior. Based upon the numbers, the disadvantaged populations fare better. Here comes the kind of the conclusions and comments. So the low-income population will benefit from much less of exposure increase relative to the non-low-income population. The minority population will be almost at parity in 2025 relative to non-minorities and receive less exposure in 2035. I wanted to emphasize that the PM 2.5 exposure are from on-road sources, and we did not consider wind dispersion. Next, I'm going to talk about the second example, the region-wide transit access to Tier 1 employment centers. Tier 1 employment centers are areas with 50,000 or more jobs. We have a total of 5 in our region. The region-wide transit access, right now we're considering is just walk access to transit. We do not consider the drive access to transit. That will make the transit share much bigger. So the total travel time includes in-vehicle time, transfer wait time, access and egress time. We did not include the first initial wait time because we're thinking people knows that where they're going, so they knows the transit the bus schedule, so they will be more prepared. So we first create a transit schedule of a list of microzone to microzone within 30 minutes in AM period, then summarize population from origin zones to destination zones within any Tier 1 employment center. This table shows the percentage of population for no build and build scenarios. As we can see, the 2050 build scenario has higher percentage of population with access due to the planned rail and next-gen rapid bus projects. The second step is to get the percentage point difference between build and no build scenarios by the population group. So here comes the third step of the table to get the percentage point difference between social equity focused population and non-focused population. The access measures reflects the potential population to the destinations. They are not really actually modeled simulated travel in ABM. Just want to make that clear. And then the low-income population relative to non-low-income population will be at parity in 2025 and then improve through 2050. The minority population relative to non-minority will follow a similar trend as the low-income population. Here comes to my last slide. Social equity analysis at person and household level using ABM provides a more complete picture and provides flexibility to analyze the data compared to aggregate zone level analysis. And also we acknowledge that it is difficult to forecast where socially disadvantaged individuals will reside and what their transmission needs will be for the horizon years in the future. So this concludes my presentation. Any questions or go over that after during the Q&A session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ying, for the wonderful presentation. And I don't want to waste much time in the transition. So let's welcome William and Alex for the next part in the presentation. And Nora, the is yours.
Great, thanks, Shinbo. And it's great to see so many folks on the webinar to discuss this topic. So William and I are going to kind of take a step back and give some high-level thoughts and perspectives on equity analysis that are grounded in our academic experiences conducting research in this area, and then also experiences working with agencies, activists, and advocates on these questions. So next slide. And so I'm going to start with three provocations just to kind of spice things up a little bit. So the first one is that we would argue that model type is relatively unimportant. Travel demand model type is relatively unimportant for actually advancing equity and justice goals. So whether you have a four-step model, an agent-based model, an activity-based model, there are better and worse ways to use those models and their results to understand transportation equity conditions in your region. And for us, the fundamental kind of element that we want to look at is the extent to which our transportation plans, policies, and programs are actually addressing the needs and barriers faced by people that are experiencing transportation disadvantage, rather than looking at the relative conditions between two different groups, or sorry, several different groups potentially. And then two related points. One is that access is a critical but underused performance measure. Access, sometimes referred to as accessibility. And then the third point is that measuring transport poverty, which we'll define later, is more powerful than measuring transport inequality. So by transport poverty, we mean thinking about the extent to which people have access to a level of transportation resources that is sufficient for meeting their needs, as opposed to just thinking about the relative distributions between groups. So we would argue that if you use access and if you think about transport poverty, then you're probably getting closer to identifying and addressing needs and barriers. And again, you can do that with an activity-based model, four-step model, an agent-based model, sketch planning tool, whatever. And then Willem dropped this link where we have a blog post that kind of elaborates on some of these points if you're interested. Okay, next slide. The impetus for thinking through the equity and justice implications of transportation projects and plans flow from numerous laws, regulations, and executive agency guidance in the United States. It all kind of starts with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination in programs that receive federal funding. But kind of growing out of Title VI, DOT and its modal agencies have adopted various regulations. There have been executive orders that various presidential administrations have promulgated that are relevant to equity analysis. There's a report here that's cited, a report that I prepared for Federal Transit Administration that talks about these each in more detail. But the important takeaway here that I want to impress upon you is that despite this kind of overwhelming amount of legal and regulatory guidance, it's still very much up to an individual agency and individual analysts, the precise type of equity analysis that they want to employ. And so for this reason, we see lots of variation in practice and in academic literature on transportation equity analysis. So next slide, Will. There are three that I'm kind of going to talk about here. So the first one, and kind of the lowest on the hierarchy, which we would argue provides kind of the least meaningful information about people's transportation needs and barriers, we have proximity analysis that simply looks at how close people are to different types of transportation infrastructure. It's not really grounded in why people need transportation, right, to get to the things that they need, right? It just looks at the extent to which people can get to infrastructure, not necessarily to opportunities. And then the proximity analysis can also be misused. For example, if you look at highway infrastructure and argue that proximity to highway infrastructure is a benefit, well, we know that in fact there are costs associated with that proximity as well. Travel demand model-based analyses, I'll thank Ying from Sandag for showing us a real nice state of the practice analysis. These types of analyses often look at defining environmental justice areas and then looking at outcomes from the plan for environmental justice populations and non-environmental justice populations, and then looking at the percentage change or the absolute change and trying to argue that environmental justice areas or populations get disproportionate benefits from the plan. And this would be an example of a transportation inequality analysis that's just looking at relative distributions between groups, not thinking about whether people have access to a sufficient level of access that allows them to lead a meaningful life and get the things that they need. And then a third type of analysis involves actually trying to identify and address needs and barriers. And this is an image taken from Plan Hillsborough, the MPO in the Tampa Metro in Florida. They authored a non-discrimination and equity plan that I think does a really good job at incorporating qualitative research and information about people's travel needs and barriers into a quantitative analysis. And so I'm going to pass it over to Willem in a sec, but just to kind of set the stage, we've got these kind of things in mind, some of the limitations of existing approaches and what we would argue are higher practices. We know that we have model data. How should we best be using them? And that's what Willem is going to talk about.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for setting me up. Perfectly for that. I don't have to do the same intro, but what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation is, this concept of, we have these model outputs, we have these travel times and these demand matrices and things like that come from the model. And while I think it behooves us to be careful about how we use them, if we have them, I think it does make sense to use them as a way to investigate, the potential benefits that are being proposed, as well as sort of what the region looks like now and how those the problems in the region might be addressed by the plan. The idea, so we're going to focus on kind of three main questions when we're investigating sort of the potential benefits from things through a model. The first one is sort of, I think, the most important, which is to use the model or use other data that we have to sort of figure out how inequitable or unjust the current state of the system is. Marginal improvements or not making things worse is great, but if the system is already at a place that's very unjust, small improvements may not be sufficient for whatever the goals of the organization and the plan is. And so I would argue that if we're going to spend $1 or an hour extra of work, it should be at doing a better job of understanding the current problems compared to forecasting. Then the next two questions. So when we're looking at benefits, so specifically what we're looking at is how the benefits from various potential modeling scenarios or potential plans, we're talking about transportation forecast plans, how those are both concentrated among population groups. So really asking the question, are marginalized population groups or population groups of concern receiving a benefit, more of a benefit than potentially non-marginalized groups, or is it working towards closing those gaps in the inequities in our system? And the third question is what we're going to focus on the analytics with the time that we have, which is about transport poverty, and I will define it more in detail in a minute. But the concept of transport poverty is this idea that you can be transport disadvantaged. So if you live in an area that has poor transport, if we're talking about public transit, has poor public transit access, has poor public transport, it doesn't serve the needs of that area very well, and you are also marginalized in some way, then you are in transport poverty. And so we can start to ask questions about lifting people out of transport poverty rather than just focusing on how the benefits are concentrated. This is the sort of one slide of showing sort of the various things that we seem to like to measure. This is work that we're doing with various agencies, including Metrolinx in Toronto. Using the model outputs, there's sort of these 4 performance measures of the system that we can look at. Proximity, we talked a little bit about. I think proximity can be useful as a first blush to sort of understand, if people don't live anywhere near transit, that's obviously the base problem that needs to be addressed from a transit perspective. But obviously, we have to be wary about over relying on those kind of outputs. There's a couple of things we can measure with the model, so we can look specifically at mobility, at travel time savings, and see if areas with marginalized populations are seeing travel time savings and mobility savings to where they're moving at a higher proportion than other areas. And we can also use the model demand matrices, or the flow matrices that come between origins and destinations, to investigate a little bit about how mode shift is happening, right? So with the sort of concept that if you're improving the attractiveness of transit and people are making more transit trips than, say, auto trips, there's a switch that is happening, and that comes from an underlying portion of the model, which is sort of a higher average utility. And so we can use a little bit of that output, which is not common in other access analyses, to get a little bit at some of the components of what I think is the important measure, as Alex mentioned, which is access to destinations. And we can look at the current state and the future state in various ways. If you're interested in sort of playing around with how to do these measures, I highly recommend, and you can have these slides after for sure, so you can get the links there. Taking a look at a package put together with Mobilizing Justice in Toronto, which contains sort of sample model output, as well as Python workbooks and a sort of handbook to go along with it, to be able to compute some of these measures, in a sandbox type environment. So I recommend taking a look at that. There's no discussion of transport poverty in that one, so perhaps there's an update that needs to happen, but I recommend taking a look at that. Just so we're on the same page about access to opportunities, it's often referred to or often referred to as sort of a measure of freedom, a measure of possibility. And I think it's important to sort of recognize that there's sort of 2 families of ways to measure access. And it's important to sort of pick one, I think, that matches the scenario. So in this diagram, we have sort of this concept of cumulative accessibility. So the question is, how many of these blue boxes can I reach in, say, 45 minutes of travel time? You can reach 5 of them. If I made that 60 minutes, perhaps there would be more blue boxes. And those blue boxes can represent, jobs. They can represent education seats, so university seats or park space. And we can look, bigger is generally better. But for some destinations, more is not necessarily better. What's important is how far away the closest one is. So there's the flip side. And you can ask sort of for these green diamonds, what is the closest green diamond, or the third closest green diamond, or the fifth or the eighth or whatever closest green diamond to you. And that can be your measure. So obviously smaller in that case is considered better. And this is useful for sort of interchangeable destinations. I like to use McDonald's as an example. The closest McDonald's is probably enough because McDonald's are relatively interchangeable. You don't really need to know how many McDonald's you can reach in 45 minutes. So it's important to just keep those in mind as we're doing those types of measures. And the reason access is so important, so you may be familiar with this diagram. I don't know if you've seen it before. It's kind of pulled from, reproduced from Jarrett Walker's book, Human Transit, where he sort of postulates these 7 desires for transit people want. And access kind of sits sort of centrally, quite centrally in these desires. So, it's time-based. Access can be different at different times of day. And it's dependent on how far you can go. Can you reach things in a reasonable amount of time is a question access asks. And the freedom overall of what you can do just with transit is measured pretty well with access. And it gets to that concept that access to opportunities measures both the performance, or sort of the quality of the transit network, the speed, the frequency, as well as the land use as well. So you can make access better by improving land use or by improving the transit network. And it sort of brings that tricky thing of bringing land use and transportation together in one model. So you can take a look at the examples from the mobilizing justice work to look at sort of some of the egalitarian measures. I'm not going to get into them, but there's a few sort of philosophies in terms of transportation justice, and what's quite common and what we see a lot in these plans are utilitarian or egalitarian measures. So utilitarian being, are we kind of lifting the average utility or the average amount of access up? The egalitarian one does, what Alex was showing a little bit, which was comparing whether the benefits are equal or equitable. And we've moved to this, trying to sort of implement and find ways to measure transport poverty and sufficientarianism. So are there places in the area where people don't have a sufficient level of transport access, and how do we make that access sufficient? So that comes down to measuring transport poverty. So again, if there's an area with if you're a marginalized group living in an area that has a very low level of transportation, or it's below a transportation disadvantage line, let's say, then you are considered to be in transport poverty. And transport poverty as a measure has been shown to be connected to a number of different things, including activity, participation, and actually going out and doing things. So to measure transport poverty, there's sort of this one equation that I think is worth looking at, because it's able to sort of capture a number of different aspects of transport poverty. So it's called the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke measure. All good measures have 3 last names attached to them. And we can kind of walk through it very quickly. So you're taking an average, so you're dividing your total sum that we're going to get by a population. That's what the N is. And what you're doing is you're going through each individual that's considered in poverty or below the poverty line, and you are measuring their relative distance from the poverty line, right? So if the poverty line here is measured with Z, and the individual has an axis of below Z, then you can get an indexed difference between the poverty line and that individual's access. And then you can raise it to a power to weight the gap differently. So, and then you take that up, you add that all up, you divide it by the total population, right? So alpha in this particular case, if alpha is 0, well, then the sum just becomes the total number of people in poverty divided by the total number of people in a group, and then you have a poverty rate, right? But it can be useful sometimes to not necessarily just want to measure the poverty rate, because there's an incentive. The best way to improve the poverty rate is to improve the transportation of the people just below the poverty line, rather than sort of lifting people from far below the poverty line up as well. So if you put alpha to 1, you can sort of get the average poverty gap. So the average poverty gap, if you square it, which is common in the economic application. You sort of get the poverty gap weighted again by the poverty gap. So you're weighting individuals far below the line much higher than those close to the line. And the nice thing about this measure is that you can do this for everybody, or you can do this for individual population groups. So you can look at, the relative poverty rate, shall we say, for a marginalized group or for a group in poverty in some way. And you can also look at everybody, and you can learn about groups being overrepresented or underrepresented in this measure. The tricky part is determining a poverty line. So you can do that based on relative access. You could, for example, do the bottom 25%. And to illustrate that, I'll just give you an example and illustrate a little bit why this is an important measure and why it tells a story that's very important, and why considering large amounts of different demographic groups can tell individual stories as well. So just for context, this is the greater Golden Horseshoe. It is around Toronto. It's the area surrounding Toronto. About 10 million people, 20% of Canada's population lives in this area. And so we've divided it up, just for this illustration, into a number of different regions, sort of a centralized Toronto area, an urbanized Greater Toronto area, a non-urbanized Greater Toronto area, and then an urban and non-urban sort of regional fringe area, shall we call it. And if you consider sort of the whole region versus looking at different parts of the region, you get a little bit of different stories. So here's the kind of output that you can produce with this kind of poverty measure. So what we see here, so this is focusing just on the Toronto area. And what we did was we set the poverty line we took everybody and we set the poverty line at the bottom 25 percentile of access to jobs. So the poverty line is 25% access to jobs. So we expect for the average person, for everybody, if we're not considering individual groups, that 25% of people are going to be in transport disadvantage, right? That's what that vertical dotted line is. But then we can do that same analysis using that same poverty line, that same level of access to jobs in this particular case. And we can do that analysis, that FGT calculation, for different groups. And we can see who's over and underrepresented. So folks to the right of this dashed line are overrepresented in terms of transport poverty, right? So that includes, visible minorities, larger groups, visible minorities, immigrants. There's of course intersectionality with that. And then there are groups that are much below. So in Toronto, there's a fair amount of people that spend 30% or more of their income on rent, but they live in relatively transport or low transport disadvantage areas, right? So they're a little bit underrepresented. We can do the same thing just as a comparative example this is the non-urbanized. So it was a purple region. It was the non-urbanized Toronto area. So sort of still central, but not a specifically urbanized area. And you can see that the distribution of groups is very different. Indigenous people are much more overrepresented. People with homes needing repairs are much more overrepresented. And while these are small sort of totals of the population, 1% and 2% of the population, if you were to roll this into a larger category or a larger group or even a larger region, those populations get a little bit washed out. And so there's stories here about marginalization, by definition, in a way, marginalized groups tend to be smaller groups. And so there's a story here about differences in representation and transport poverty. So there's a bunch of examples and a bunch of data, and I'm happy to answer questions after we finish. But the takeaway message here is that we need to sort of do a better job of sort of opening up the scope of what we're looking at, consider a little bit the areas of what we're looking at, and find ways to integrate the feedback we get from communities specifically into some of this quantitative analysis, which I think then needs to be translated back into qualitative results and qualitative discussion as well. So I'm going to leave it there. We'll put up those provocations again because they're fun. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer any questions when we get to them.
All right. Thank you so much, for Alex and William, for the insightful presentations. And now we have around 18 minutes for the Q&A session or part. And I will start with the questions in the chat box. And we do have a few questions from the registration, like when you register, you can put your questions there. So I kind of switch back and forth. I think the first question that I see was mostly asked was, I will summarize that between a few folks like Lisa and Amanda, and there's also Luisa from Santa Clara County asked the question. I will use one of them, how they phrase them. One of the elements of equity analysis is to look at impacts on different races. How do we take race into equation when we look into the horizon years in models? Do we simply assume the future racial composition to be similar to the baseline? And Lisa expanded that question to races and income level. So I would like, I think Amanda also mentioned the immigration and emigration as far as that particular issue. So can each of the Ziying or and Alex or Willem address that one? This one is the most popular question actually. So whoever wants to jump in, you can go first.
I unmuted first. I suppose I could start unless Alex has some thoughts, but we're talking about forecasting demographics, right? That's, I think, ultimately what we're talking about. And that's a sticky wicket is what I call it, but it's a tricky proposition because forecasting already makes so many assumptions about behavior and about people that if you're applying that now at a race level or an income level, you're sort of making other assumptions about those kinds of things. And there's two ways I think about it. So one would be that if we identify the problems now and try to address the problems that exist now, I think that's a more effective way than to address things and the error that comes with this than the error that's introduced in trying to forecast demographics, right? So I think identifying the problems now in a better way and working to focus on them is better. So from a data perspective, yes, we're using those current day populations forecasted into the future as being the same, or the ratios or the relative percentages. We've also done a little bit of, you can do a bit of a sensitivity analysis. So you can do things like, model a very simple idea such as gentrification, where, places with higher access, rich people move to places with higher access, poor people move to places without high access. And you can look at how quickly, the inequality in the region shifts as you move people. And so you're not forecasting the demographics, but you're understanding the sort of sensitivity of your model. So I'll leave it there and see if other people have thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. So I second Willem's idea to think about kind of what's going on in the current year, what's going on in the near term. So, there are a lot of forecasters on the webinar, and we want to look 20 or 30 years out. And it's really hard to get a 30-year forecast right. Whenever we do analyses of how well forecasts have performed, they often perform poorly. So I think that models are powerful tools, right? We take a small sample of respondents to a household activity and travel survey, and we can expand it to an entire population, and then understand how people are traveling and what their travel needs and barriers might be. The one thing, I think the question about race and ethnicity is right on, and that's when I first started working in this area in the early 2010s, the one thing that shocked me was that we had these new activity-based models that were coming online, right? You have a micro-simulated population, a synthetic population. The synthetic population, people are put into households. There's a household size, there's automobile ownership, the households have income, but surprisingly, the households didn't have a race. And so it wasn't possible to look at equity analysis outcomes by race in the regions that I was looking at. And I still don't think I've seen an activity-based model where race is included. And so I think as a profession, we need to really consider that race and ethnicity matter for travel behavior. It's something that I think is difficult for us to accept, but the empirical evidence bears that out. And once we do that, then we can include them in our models. And then I think using them, again, for kind of near-term analyses is probably one of the highest uses. Ying, I don't know if you want to jump.
Yes, I think there's a lot of questions about like demographic forecast. So I actually trying to get a hold of our land use modelers to cover this, but they are actually at a meeting right now. But yeah, so synthetic population, we had controls at task level for like number of workers, number of children. I could not pull up the document to see what other control variables are, but I acknowledge it. The race might, it's not in the control. Yeah, so it will be hard to forecast that. That's for sure.
I think maybe one of the additional problems, at least in the Toronto area, is that, you know, the model in Toronto is heavily reliant on a travel survey, a very good travel survey, the Transportation Tomorrow survey, but that survey doesn't ask demographic questions. It asks a few income questions, but it doesn't connect people's trips with demographics. And I think that's changing this time around, which is useful from a current state perspective. But of course, you know, forecasting is hard, one data point for sure. So I hope that shifts into collecting present day data that includes some of this intersectional questions.
All right, thank you for the answers. And there's another question from the registration, like for the equity. What do you think about the equity of outcomes versus the equity of investments? Now, what's your thoughts on that? Is there any volunteers jumping?
I mean, I think for me, well, I'll just say quickly, like, I think that the transportation infrastructure doesn't exist. We don't build it just so it can kind of sit there and we can look at it, right? People have to use it to get to education, healthcare, jobs, social connections, places of worship, etc. And you know, we all know that travel is a derived demand. And so for me, our equity analyses have to center that understanding of travel. And so that requires looking at outcomes, not just looking at investments. I think you could make the case that there's some value in looking at investments, but it gets a little difficult. Like the example I gave of highway infrastructure, I've seen many agencies that will say like, oh, we're spreading highway infrastructure all over the region, but for many communities and specific demographic groups and places, there's a legacy of harm that highways have wrought, and that's not really taken into account. So there are like qualitative differences in the impacts associated with different pieces of infrastructure. Even like something as benign as a bike lane can be seen as a troubling sign of impending neighborhood change by some communities. And so I think we discount those understandings of infrastructure at our peril.
Yeah. I also, so there's, you know, inputs, outputs, and outcomes. There's a great book called Bad Data by Peter Shrivers, which I recommend everybody should look at and have a copy on their desk. It's very good. And there's an argument there, of course, that, you know, politicians love inputs, right? Politicians love, we're increasing this many hours, we're buying this many buses, those kinds of things. And outcomes are extremely hard to measure. They require a much, much more robust amount of measurements. And so I think, you know, focusing on outputs is that middle ground. You know, and I think access as a measure I would plug, it kind of gets at that outcome and output level compared to just looking at sort of mobility or even ridership level stuff.
All right. Ying, if you want to add anything, if you don't want, that's fine. We can switch to the next question.
Yeah, I was trying to answer the questions in the chat box.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
The ones
then
that are related to us.
Go ahead, and I will. So next question to William. So Aichung son does ask a question. So he asked, does transit access calculations consider park and ride as well? If yes, how is it calculated for William?
I mean, you can calculate access in any way you want relative to the quality of the data you have, right? And the technology that you're using, right? So if we're using model outputs, then the question is for the modelers. What is considered in that level of access? You know, you can even do things like perceived travel time instead of actual travel time measures as well. There are some tools out there, open source tools that let you calculate access, current day level access, and that kind of thing. Well, it can be future access too if you have the transportation network, and that kind of thing. You can do all sorts of permutations, allowing drive to transit, allow bike to transit, not allow walking, do all sorts of restrictions, and those will change the results to a certain extent and are worth looking at. Of course, it is possible to sort of get into the problem where you do too many permutations, but there is some research out there looking at sort of the choices that you make when you measure access and how those might reflect outcomes, both in terms of what parameters you pick for weighting and things like that, as well as the way you measure it. Alex, I think Rafael Pereira had a paper that looked at that, and so did Maipo Kwan.
I was typing responses to questions in the Q&A box, so I didn't catch your whole response.
Okay, just in terms of choosing different parameters and ways of measuring access.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Maipo Kwan has a classic paper where she compares different space-time measures of access compared to integral measures of access. So like cumulative opportunities and gravity measures. And then, Rafa Pereira has done various comparisons. I mean, this question often comes up. We present the access results. It's like there are a lot of different ways to measure access. Different types of destinations are important to different groups. Different modes are important to different groups. Different people have different tolerances or different travel time budgets. That's one of the first provocations was that we need to focus on needs and barriers, and that access can help us get at needs and barriers. So I think doing a better job at tailoring access measures to the specific populations who are experiencing transportation disadvantage or transportation poverty can be a really powerful method for advancing equity.
All right, quick question for William. What was the book mentioned by you? Data by Peter Schreiber?
Yeah, put it in the chat. It's Bad
right.
Data by Peter Schreivers. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And thank you all for typing those questions. Like, I think it's kind of multitasking. Like you answer like live and also live, and also at the same time trying to type it, the answers. And for all the attendees, you can also see some answers in the answered Q&A tab over there. And our speakers already answered a lot of questions over there. So for those are still open, let me see.
Can I field this one from Amanda?
Sure, no problem. Yeah.
So this question from Amanda about should we talking about poverty and inequality, and should we focus on both aspects? So bringing people out of poverty, but then leveling the field. I think it does translate to transportation. And the majority of analyses that I see in practice are of the kind of inequality type. So just thinking about different outcomes for different groups. And if you look just at, say, transit access in your plan, you look at EJ populations, non-EJ populations, and you show that EJ populations get a little bit more access improvement than the rest of the population, and like that's equitable. You're not capturing the fact that public transit in your region could be very bad in general, right? And so it's not actually meeting anyone's needs. So even though they're getting a little bit more, and you're concluding that it's equitable, it's not actually allowing people to lead a meaningful life. And so I think like these concepts of poverty are really important, and they haven't really translated into practice yet. That's changing with some of Willem's work. Karl Martens has a book called Transport Justice. He was the first person to bring these FGT measures over into transport. And Rafa Pereira and I have been thinking about how to apply them more, but I think it's a harder problem, right? You have to define the threshold, and then you're probably going to find gaps, especially if you're looking at transit. And then like, what do you do about it? If you're like an MPO, you don't really have control over the amount of federal funds that are flowing to your transit agency. You can't necessarily sponsor a sales tax measure, but I think just highlighting that there is a gap, right? Like there is a substantial population in poverty. We want to bring transit access up to a certain level. I think that can be powerful. And like, especially for MPOs, I think having those conversations, doing those analyses and exposing those gaps can be really important, and a really powerful way that MPOs can highlight problems of injustice in their regions.
All right, thank you. We have 4 minutes left, and let me bring up like another perspective, a question asked during the registration. So this question is asked by Jen from UNC Chapel Hill. The question is, how do transportation planners typically define equity And Jane also mentioned, is health equity included in this approach? Or like in general, like what do you think about the equity as far as health?
I think one of the ideas we actually planners asked us if we could compare access to like healthy food resources, you know, like instead of going to the fast food restaurant, but like grocery stores or you know, the answer from us is like, okay, we know the current existing locations of these you know, places, but then in order for us to forecast in the future, we're not sure if, you know, like these store locations or land use designations and stuff that might change, you know, it's not up to us to decide. So yeah, I think it's still a challenge. But then that's why we introduced the particular matter 2.5 as a health burden type of measure. Yeah.
And also, I do remember your analysis, like you do have the access to hospital in the SANDAC, like examples, not in the slides, but I think there are some analysis to access to hospitals. Is that right?
Yeah, we have that. Yeah, but that's just access. Yeah, medical facilities and hospitals. Yeah.
I mean, just to chime in also, one other aspect that transportation affects health is through the viability of using non-motorized modes, right? Walking and biking. So I've seen this pop up in various analyses where we'll show that outcomes for, say, Black people or brown people, they have higher rates of walking. They're walking more minutes per day. The walking rate increases in the plan. That's great. And that's seen to be a health benefit. But we don't differentiate between people that are walking by choice and walking in environments that are pleasant to walk in, and those that are kind of constrained, right? They have inadequate automobile ownership, there's poor transit, and so they're forced to walk incredibly long distances, potentially in extreme heat, and that also has a health cost. So I think conversations about health and transportation do kind of intersect in certain instances, but we need to do a better job, especially of differentiating between choice and constraint in travel behavior and in equity analysis.
All right, sounds good. And I do see, I think all of the questions in the Q&A chat box actually have been answered, and it's good. And we have to wrap up at this time at an hour mark, and I have to say thank you so much for participating. And Zephyr Foundation is a nonprofit organization, and we are operated based on the membership contribution. So if you do have the resource and the budget, please join our membership. If you haven't reviewed, please do so by going to our website, by searching Zephyr Transport or Zephyr Foundation, and you'll see the membership tab on the first page. And also another thing is, if you are interested in the future learning sessions like this, and you can also subscribe. If you haven't done so, subscribe our email list at the same page. All right, I think that's it. And thank you again, Ziying, Alex, and Willem, for doing the wonderful presentations. And I look forward to see most of you next time virtually for the next learning session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.